Well, good morning to all of you again, and it's wonderful to be able to see you. Had a very nice travel up here, a nice trip, some sunny to start with, and then as I got here, cloudy. So I think it's going to warm up here in the afternoon. We should enjoy that quite a bit. Well, after the conference that we had in Cincinnati in the beginning of May, I gave you somewhat of an update of what it was that was covered, how it was that different things were presented, and we went over different topics there at the conference. One of those in particular was regarding the Hebrew calendar. And what we experienced in the couple of hours of explanation regarding that topic I thought was absolutely wonderful. It was excellent, and it clearly re-emphasized what we have been doing for the last 80 years, that we use the Hebrew calendar as a guide. And yet, as they did bring this up, as they wanted to address it, they had been studying it, they being the Council of Elders and others in the in ministry who would deal with these kind of things. They have received, I guess all the time, or at least over the years, they received numerous questions about the calendar and about the significance of that and why it is that's what we use. And of course, they're able to look at those and take into consideration what's being presented, what we already know, what we already do, and whether or not there's any biblical information that we need to consider. The fact is, I don't know that this is a question or concern here in the area. I don't believe it is. I know it is in at least a few places across the United States and maybe in other parts of the world. But the thing that stood out to me, we had 5 of our 12 Council of Elders members present this topic. They each presented a small section. Every one of them very, very good as far as giving information that you need to know. And I will tell you, I'm not going to go through an exhaustive review of the Hebrew calendar for you today because I can't. It's only been 53 years I've studied anything about the Hebrew calendar. It was in a college class, and I don't remember much about it, except I do know that we need to be unified in what we do, and I do know that that's what God expects of us. And even the verse, I want to read this one verse here in Luke 6 and just tell you that this is what Jesus says. And in Luke chapter 6, verse 43, let me see if I can read this from the New King James. It says, for a good tree, Luke 6:43, a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Verse 44, every tree is known by its fruit. Men don't gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. Now, you can say, well, what is that talking about? Well, Jesus was just pointing out a principle. He was pointing out a principle that often we have to look at the fruit of not so much trees, but of ideas or things that happen to be discussed or thought about. And what kind of fruit does it produce? Does it produce good fruit and building up and edifying, or does it create division? Does it create confusion? And as one of the members of the council clearly said, what we have seen from disputes over calendar issues is division. It is not unified. It is not, that's what all of us should be seeking. We should be seeking to be unified, and not only within the church, but most of all with God. That's what we want to be unified, who we have to be. Jesus says, the Father and I are one. And he says we are to be one with him and one with the Father. There's so much credibility to desire to have the unity of the Spirit and unity of the faith. And so I wanted to just present some of the information. You can't go over all of it, and there were two different papers that were presented mostly. They probably were available before that, but presented to us and available to you should you like to read them. There is a Hebrew calendar summary paper that's about 10 pages. I want to read a little bit of that today. And then there's a 110-page, comprehensive discussion of all the questions and problems that come up. But ultimately it comes down to who has God authorized to decide what we're going to do as a group, as a church, as the Church of God. And we can clearly say we go back to what has been done over the last 40 years for basically all of us having come into the church during that time. And so I want to begin just by pointing out that the significance of the fact that we do use, and you are able to benefit from, the use of the Hebrew calendar to determine when the holy days are. It's important for us to understand that. Whether we understand, and I would say I surely don't understand all of the intricacies and all of the questions or all of the answers regarding the topic, but it does guide how we worship God. We know we've already had the spring holy days, the summer holy day, the fall holy days are coming up. We know when the Feast of Trumpets is. We know when the Day of Atonement will be and when the feast will start and when the last great day will conclude. We know that because that's based on biblical information from the Hebrew calendar. And of course most of you have a little card that you might carry and tells you for the next 5 years when is it going to be, because it's all determined. It's already calculated. And so it does, most of all, affect how we worship God. We have to know when to do that. And yet, unfortunately, there have been calendar issues throughout, the last 50, 80 years. There were calendar issues long before that. Calendar being, just when are you observing the holy days? When are you following God in that way? And so, some of you remember in 74, we had a correction regarding the day of Pentecost. We were not, we misunderstood a verse and needed to correct, that we were not keeping it on Monday, but on Sunday as we have since then. And so, we're aware that that's significant, but that had to be addressed at the time when we came to understand what God wanted us to do. You could also say in 95, it was even a bigger when do you worship issue, because, people were abandoning the Sabbath and abandoning the holy days, abandoning these designated days of God. And yet you can go back into the Old Testament and even see. I think it's alarming when you read in 1 Kings 12. Well, I'll read a couple of these verses. 1 Kings 12, this was after Solomon's death, and Rehoboam was his son and was going to be the king in Judah at that time. But of course it was not quite yet, it was Israel yet. And it was going to be divided into Judah and Israel because Jeroboam was going to rise up and he was going to create a division within Israel. Let's look at this in chapter 12 of 1 Kings. In verse 32, at that time, Jeroboam, now he wanted to resist the rule, the authority that Rehoboam had, and he wanted the people to follow him. And so what did he do? Well, in verse 32, Jeroboam appointed a festival. So they were used to at least awareness of and observing festivals that God had given them. Jeroboam appointed a festival on the 15th day of, the 8th month. Not the 7th month, as we all know. The Feast of Tabernacles from Leviticus 23 is described as being in the 7th month. And so Jeroboam was going to set up a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival that was in Judah. So he was going to change when it was that the people should worship God. And he offered sacrifices in the altar. And he did this in Bethel, sacrificing the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priest of the high places that he had made. Again, this was set up by him, not by God. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that he alone had devised. So he came up with a brilliant idea to get the people to follow him. Do the Feast of Tabernacles another time. Do it at a different day, or a different, in this case, month. Same day, but different month. But as it says in verse 33, he did that in the month that he alone had devised. He appointed a festival for the people, and he went up to the altar to offer incense. That was his way of keeping things similar but different. Follow me instead of following Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. Interestingly, if you back up, it says where he set up in verse 29 his kind of places of worship. He set one in Bethel and the other one in Dan. And in verse 30, this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one at Bethel and before the other at the house up in Dan. And so, this was, again, you could say, when do we worship on the holy day issue. And I will only mention that whenever you see any of the revivals, there weren't too many in the nation of Israel or the nation of Judah following this. There were a few in Judah that were reasonably better, or you could say good, compared to all the others who were evil, it says. But in the days of Hezekiah or in the days of Josiah, the revivals that occurred were directing people back to, well, look what the law says. This is what it says. This is what we need to do. And of course, it doesn't directly describe all of the things that they were directed to do, but they actually, I guess, let's see, in 2 Kings, if I get the right verse here, 2 Kings 18, I think. I may not have the right one written down here. Oh, no, it's in chapter 23. Yeah, 2 Kings 23. It says this was in the time of Josiah, and he was bringing people back to a proper worship of God. They had been ignoring it for years. Other kings had been, neglectful. Josiah, 2 Kings 23, the king directed that all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem should be gathered to him. This was Josiah. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him went the people of Judah and the inhabitants of the land, small and great. And he read in the hearing of all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. And the king stood by the pillar. He made a covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord, keeping his commands, his decrees, his statutes, with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant that were written in this book. And the people joined in that covenant. So that was the type of revival that he was instituting. We need to get back to what it says in the book of the law, in the books that we are familiar with here in the Holy Scriptures. And down in verse 21, here's a part of what it was that they were rejuvenated with. The king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God as prescribed in this book of the covenant. And it says no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. In the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. So it's only mentioning that one of the holy days that are clearly written about in Leviticus 23, began to be a part of what they wanted to do. And so I point this out only because, many times you have people become confused, and we do have at least a few who are confused about how it is we should worship God. And yet, all of us need to be able to do that sincerely, and we need to be able to do that wholeheartedly, and that's a part of why we have clear instruction about how it is that we determine when the holy days are throughout the year. Now, as I mentioned, obviously this is not presenting any kind of change from our past teachings, and as I said, both of these extensive papers, one far more extensive than the other, are available for all of us to read and study. And actually the summary page, which is about 10, or summary report, is really very, very good, because it kind of brings up whatever questions you might have about something and then gives a clear answer. And it also points out that everything about the calendar is not clearly defined in the Bible. It just isn't. And so there has to be, some clarity about, well, what do you do? Well, if you're going to worship God, then you need to have direction. And God does give that direction. So, other than affecting how it is we worship God, the second thing I'll point out is just simply that God has instituted the heavens in such a way that there is predictability, that there is order, that there is what I would call a heavenly clock, a very precise heavenly clock. And you see this. Let's look back at Genesis chapter 1. I want to read these again out of the New King James. Genesis 1 verse 14, this is dealing with, I believe it's day 4 of creation. Verse 14 of Genesis 1, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day and the night. And let them be for what? For signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years. Let them be for lights in the firmament, to give light on the earth," and so it was so. In verse 16, God made these two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and He made the stars. So, all of us, and I certainly know that at least with an elemental education of, the way that the moon goes around the earth and the way the earth goes around the sun, we understand those today better and have more information available than has ever been the case in the centuries before. Some of that was only being developed in the several hundred years before us. And yet we have lots of information. You've got astronomers and mathematicians who can calculate stuff out to a great, great degree. And yet they have to point out that, the sun and the moon, I enjoy seeing the full moon. You really can't see the new moon. I mean, you don't know when it is. It's often very, very faint. And if it's cloudy, you don't see anything. If it's cloudy, you don't even see a full moon. But I often enjoy that, and I know, actually because at the Feast of Tabernacles, the beginning, and at the time of the Passover, we all know that pretty much every time it's going to have a full moon. And that's something that we can appreciate and enjoy and be thankful for. And yet, the whole thing of the alignment in the heavens is that every 19 years, and you've heard, I'm sure, of a 19-year time cycle, every 19 years, this Metonic cycle, in a sense, kind of reoccurs. And what you have is taking into consideration in a sense, the elliptical orbit of the moon, because sometimes it's a little closer and sometimes a little further away from us, but it's going to come around each month, approximately at a certain time. And you also have an elliptical orbit with the sun, with the earth going around the sun. And so it's not always exactly the same, but it is always very, very similar. And yet, I was amazed to just listen to a discussion about, how it is that these things can be learned. And again, you can study them and be probably amazed by God's precise heavenly clock. Now, you see in this cycle, as it needs to be understood, a combination of solar, Earth around the sun, and lunar, moon around the earth, a combination of cycles. And that's what's taken into consideration by the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar, I will use that term because you have to say, that any calendar has been made up by men. Any calendar, whatever we use, whether it was the Gregorian calendar and the Julian calendar. Some of you know more about that than I do. But, all of the calendars that people use in any variation of any kind, they're all made up by men. And yet, the Jews have been, in a sense, commissioned by God, to follow what information He provides in the Bible, because they are the keepers of those oracles of God. And you would think that not only includes the Bible, but also, parts of things we would want to know about the calendar or need to know. So I point this out about this heavenly clock because here in Leviticus 23, now I might say that it's clear from the Bible, the day, what the day is, about 12 hours of day, 12 hours of light, and 12 hours of dark. The day is clearly defined. The week, the 7-day cycle of the week is clearly defined in the Bible. Months are mentioned clearly, and the new moon is mentioned. And I think all of us realize that the Feast of Trumpets is the first day, the new moon of the 7th month. But you have a lot of variation through the other months, and in connection with this 19-year time cycle, you have, out of those 19 years, 7 years that the months have 12 months, and maybe I'm getting that messed up. Let's see, there's 19 years, there's 12 of them that have, I better not focus on that because I will get messed up with it. But all of those are factors that are taken into consideration whenever they determine that there should be an additional month in a year. That is what ultimately ends up being a 13th month in a year. And again, this is again the way that people would calculate time. But here in Leviticus 23, it says in verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I want you to speak to the children of Israel, and I want you to say to them, these are my These are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, that you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed festivals, the feasts of the Lord. And so here you see a direction that in Israel it is to be proclaimed. Not that everybody's going to come up with their own idea of what it is, but it is to be proclaimed by designated officials what it is or how it is we are going to have this holy convocation. Verse 6, it talks about the Sabbath, or verse 3, it talks about the Sabbath. Verse 4, these are the appointed festivals of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall celebrate at the time appointed for them. So again, you have some instruction there that, these days are to be celebrated. These days are my appointed festivals, and yet they were to be proclaimed to the people of Israel. And they were to be, the people were to follow instruction. And you also have to be aware, that it was the priesthood. Aaron and then his descendants, those who would be of the priesthood, who would proclaim when these were. And so you can look even in Deuteronomy. Well, let me read something out of this paper, the summary paper of the calendar. It says, God does state very clearly who has the delegated authority to proclaim his holy days and determine a calendar as revealed in Scripture. We just read Leviticus 23, proclaim the holy convocations that are God's feast. And in Numbers 10 verse 8, it says, the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall blow the trumpet, and they shall be to you as an ordinance forever throughout your generations. Also in the days of your gladness, in your appointed feast, and at the beginning of months, you shall blow the trumpets. And so it was the priesthood and those who were given that responsibility and authority. This goes on to say the law, the Pentateuch, or Torah, explains that it was the sons of Aaron, the priest, who had the duly authorized responsibility to proclaim God's holy days at their appointed times, and the authority to declare the months for any defined year through the blowing of trumpets. And so the new month was announced by a blowing of trumpets. It is not, or it was not, an individual matter according to one's conscience, but a duty of the authorized priesthood under the guidance of the high priest to proclaim the holy days and therefore to follow the calendar which correctly locates them. Additionally, God gave the priests under Aaron and later the appointed judges the responsibility and insight of making judgments to address specific conditions not directly stated or implied in the Bible. And that's important to realize, because if something is not directly said, this is what you do, well then a judgment would have to be made. We can look at that in Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. Starting in verse 9. You shall come to the priest, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. They shall pronounce upon you a sentence of judgment. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they order you, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgment which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or the left from the sentence that they pronounce unto you. Now the man who does act presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away evil from Israel. So it was a matter of directly stating, what everyone could know, and then if there was a question of some type of a judgment that needed to be made, these were the appointed people to do it. It is clear from the scripture above that not only not every decision regarding God's law was detailed in the law. Therefore, in addition to the priestly responsibility to proclaim God's festivals at their appointed times, they also had the delegated responsibility to make binding decisions regarding difficult matters. And when calendric decisions required a judgment, the priesthood had the delegated authority by God under the high priest to make a God-appointed determination. And the congregation then had the responsibility to do according to what they were ordered. So that part of it is very clear. That is what we see in the Bible, and it is clearly something that we are able to follow today. What we do find, and this is the third thing I'll mention, what we do find is that the calendar that the Jewish people have maintained, obviously they've done that to the best of their ability. They've not done that entirely perfectly, even it makes a provision for that in Romans 3. Whether they get it all right or not, it is a matter of that they have that responsibility. But it is biblically based, and that is why we use the Hebrew calendar. As I said, it's based on this 19-year cycle. It uses the moons and the Earth's rotation around the sun. And it's not just, even though I have followed the moons. I mean, I can at least see when the new moon is, and I can see when it's waning, or I think even Faith was figuring out when the moon was growing or it was waning. And that, that's what we can do. That's easy for us to do because we can enjoy that. But it's the sun that determines the seasons. The seasons are also an important part of this, because you don't want to be having the Passover in the dead of winter. That just won't work. And God is not wanting that. He is intending for us to understand the benefit of the harvest seasons as they are in the land of Israel, where Jerusalem is. And so those are all factors. And so the Hebrew calendar calculates which years, here I've got this written down a little better, which years have 13 months out of 19. And so, there are going to be some years out of a 19-year cycle that have 13 months and many others who have 12. That is how it is. So, again, explaining that it would be a longer discussion. And so it is a blessing to realize that as the Bible does tell us about days and weeks, it mentions months, it mentions years, but it doesn't give every detail that might need to be known. And that's why, some judgments may need to be made from the standpoint of the church. I want to go on then to something I think all of us can easily relate to, is that we know 2,000 years ago, someone was perfectly observing the holy days. And we know who that is. Jesus Christ obviously knew, what the right things were regarding the observance of the holy days. And understanding what was going on at the time of Jesus is incredibly a wonderful benefit. And again, this is something that the church has put together information and has written about, and I've mentioned this 110-page book, really, on information about the calendar, learning how it is that Jesus respected what the Sanhedrin of the Sadducees determined at the time of Christ. There's no discussion about when the Passover was. He knew when that was. His family knew when it was. You later see in the book of Acts, Acts 2, we talk about every year, day of Pentecost. Everybody knew when it was. They knew what that day was. Later, Paul's going to be keeping Pentecost. Clearly, he knew when he needed to get there, back to Jerusalem. So you have biblical reference to that. And let me read a little more out of this summary paper. The New Testament church, as a small persecuted flock, faithfully kept the Sabbath and the biblical feast, but there's no record that they were ever specifically commissioned by Christ to set up and maintain a calendar. So was the church supposed to do that, or was that something that they were going to have to rely on, correct information passed down through those God had given that a responsibility? The evidence from the New Testament writing shows they followed the Jewish proclamations of the holy days to determine when to keep the festivals, such as the Passover on the 14th day of Nisan and Pentecost, as I mentioned. The observance of the New Covenant Passover on the 14th of Nisan can be verified in Scripture and in history. The Bishop of Rome, around 155 AD, tried, around 160, to outlaw the observance of Passover, apparently as a method of avoiding the charge of Judaizing Christianity. But opposition to this effort came in the person of Polycarp, who lived in Asia Minor at that time, and according to the 4th century historian Eusebius, and this comes out of his ecclesiastical history, Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John and was well known throughout the churches in the Roman Empire of the 2nd century. Polycarp claimed to observe the Passover because it was taught to him by the Apostle John, who got it from Christ himself. The tradition of observing the Passover on the 14th of Nisan was held fast by Polycarp. So it wasn't misunderstood. It was clearly passed down. It was respected. And Paul, we ought to read Romans 3, the first couple of verses. Paul writes in Romans 3 about the advantage of being a Jew. In that section he's talking about Jew and Gentile, and he says, well, what advantage does a Jew have? Here it says, what advantage then has the Jew? And in verse 1, or what is the profit of circumcision? Well, he says, much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. The oracles of God are mentioned here. They're mentioned in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 7, verse 38, being the oracles that were given to Moses and given to Israel back then. And here, talking about, well, they were to be maintaining that. God had entrusted the Jews with the responsibility of preserving the Scriptures that we refer to as the Old Testament, what we call the Holy Scripture. These instructions were given to Moses, who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us. That's quoting Acts 7:38. They fulfilled that responsibility despite the fact that most Jews did not believe and obey these divine sayings. They didn't always agree on what to do, but they did maintain that. However, the fact that the Jews, and you read this in Romans 3, verse 3, the fact that the Jews did not faithfully obey what is written does not invalidate the promises of our faithful God. That's an interesting verse, because Paul is stating that Jew and Gentile alike can be a part of the new covenant. They can be a part of what we would refer to as the church of God. But here in discussing Judaism, he says, well, the advantage of the Jew is, in the first place, they were entrusted the oracles of God in verse 3. Some might ask, well, what if they weren't responsible, or what if they didn't do a good job, or what if they were not faithful? Will their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? Well, in verse 4 he says, by no means. That's the fact that God is still faithful. He's the one who's going to maintain that. So I think it is important for us to keep in mind that God has helped the church down through the last 2,000 years, and certainly in the last 80 years, as all of us are directly affected by the church of God. And so let me read you, in a sense, the conclusion to this discussion about the calendar. The Church of God, down to the modern era, has followed the same example as that of the early church, which was to use the calendar proclaimed by the Jews through the centuries. So they were doing that then. We are doing it now. There's reference to several different church leaders of the past. There's a reference here to Mr. Armstrong as he addressed this in 1940. He further stated in a letter, surely we can see that profane history only contradicts itself and is inaccurate and cannot be depended upon. Again, he was discussing the calendar questions, and has no authority whatsoever. There is no Bible authority for any of it. God did not commit His oracles or the preservation of His times to profane history or to the Catholic Church, but to the Israelites, and they have been preserved by the Jews. And so that was the understanding then. It is clearly the case today. He goes on, or I guess this paper goes on to say, today, those who reject the calendric calculations received from the Jewish authorities offer alternatives that range from keeping the current Hebrew calendar but without rules of postponement. Again, those are a part of what is used to determine the Hebrew calendar. But those who oppose that use the current calendar but without those rules to a variety of alternative calendars based on their private interpretation of a wide array of material. It is certainly fair to say there is little consensus when discussing a solution among those who reject the validity of the Hebrew calendar received from the Jews. It is clearly evident by the fruits that the rejection of the Hebrew calendar has been a source of division in the Jewish community and, as he was pointing out, even in the Church of God. Once the Hebrew calendar is rejected, whose calendar do you follow? Our past experience in the Church of God has shown that the fruits of people deviating from the Hebrew calendar has only caused division. And this is clearly contrary to the biblical principles found in the following verses in 1 Corinthians 14, where it tells us, that God is not the author of confusion, but wanting all things to be done decently and in order. And so this is a part of why it is, that a spiritual priesthood is set within the Church of God to decide certain matters, and clearly to follow the Hebrew calendar is what we have decided to do. So the conclusion of this paper, I will read. It's only several paragraphs, but I hope that this can, in a sense, be a settled, I think it is a settled thing for most all of us, but there are a few people elsewhere who are confused, and that is problematic. It's problematic for them, most of all, but it's problematic because the church would like for them, and of course like to discuss this with them, like them to come to see, realizing that the church has authority to determine that, otherwise you're just off doing whatever you think is right, and that's not going to benefit you or anyone else. So, this conclusion, the United Church of God has a desire for God's truth as it is expounded in the Bible. They have a desire for unity in sound doctrine and in the context of God's festivals, for a common gathering of God's people on His annual holy days. Jesus Christ gave His ministry the responsibility and authority to spiritually build up the church in the unity of the faith and the doctrine that knits God's people together so that we may grow in love toward one another. We read that, and we should be familiar with Ephesians chapter 4, where it tells us, it talks of in the beginning of that the unity of the Spirit, and later the unity of the faith that comes from all growing to become all of us growing up to be like Jesus Christ. So he says, to worship in unity, we need an authoritative calendar that identifies God's feast and annual Sabbaths, His holy days. After extensive biblical research and after taking into consideration the evidence available and reviewing input in hundreds of pages from dozens of authors and most importantly, applying biblical evidence, the United Church of God has concluded that the calendric rules according to the Hebrew calendar are the ones we should use. Most recent evidence has only further supported the Church's decision in these matters. So even though they've had questions that have arisen over 10 or 20 years, they can address this once again. The Hebrew calendar established God's holy days using calendric rules that ensure that the holy days are observed in their appointed times. That's another part of the whole plan. And this reflects God's spiritual meaning of the harvest seasons and reminds us annually of His plan of salvation. And by using the Hebrew calendar, a unity of worship during God's holy days and festivals is maintained, and the church's ministry and members can plan in advance to book halls, flights, facilities for the feast and for God's holy days. All of us know that that's what has to be done, and we do that on a yearly basis. It's always going to happen. And if we didn't know when the holy days were, or how would you even do any of that if you didn't have a definitive direction? And so that's what God has provided us in. He gives us what He does in the Bible. For things that are not directly stated in the Bible, there may have to be a judgment made, and that's what the church has done. But it certainly has not varied over the last 80 years because, if a correction was needed, then they made it. Otherwise, we look forward to what our upcoming next holy day will be, the Feast of Trumpets, which actually is the first day of the 7th month. It is the only holy day that is a new moon. And again, you won't see that new moon, I'm pretty sure, because it'll be very, very difficult to see. But of course, leading up then to the 15 days later, when the full moon is quite evident as we begin the Feast of Tabernacles. So I hope that all of us are able to enjoy the fact, that God is working with us. He is working in our lives. He's giving us many blessings. And a part of that is that we desire to honor God and to obey God as He directs. And that includes, of course, the holy days.